Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second last webinar of the very first virtual Cape Health Tech Week. I'm Jacinta Twynham. I'm the Head of Strategic Projects at Westgrow, and I'm responsible for the Cape Health Technology Initiative. The project is intended to support and grow the health technology industry of Cape Town and the Western Cape. Today's session is doing business in the health sector, and our speaker today is Professor Househam. He's a graduate of the University of Cape Town, having completed both under and postgraduate study at this university. He is a specialist pediatrician and holds an honorary professorship from the University of the Free State, where he headed the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health until January 1995. Thereafter, he became the head of the Free State Health Department in February 1995, a post which he held until 2001. In 2002, he was appointed as the head of the Western Cape Department of Health, a post which he held until his retirement on the 31st of March 2015. During his term of office, health services in the Western Cape underwent significant restructuring with the implementation of Healthcare 2010 by the Western Cape government. As head of health in the Free State and Western Cape, Professor Househam served on various national and provincial bodies and management structures. Professor Househam, thank you very much for being here today and for preparing a presentation and taking us on a masterclass on how to do business in this sector. This is an important masterclass for us because there are so many companies that we engage with at Westgrow on a daily basis who always have some other question that they would like to better understand about doing business in the health tech sector. These companies are very passionate about the work that they are doing, and in addition to that, really want to contribute meaningfully to the Western Cape economy. So I'm going to begin the presentation, Professor Househam, and we can get going.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join this webinar. I was actually as the COVID-19 lockdown began, I became aware of a lot of people who contacted me with products that they thought could assist the health sector facing the challenges of COVID-19. And it struck me that quite a number of the individuals and companies had relatively little understanding of how a medical device or how a particular innovation could be applied through the health sector. And so that's really the basis of this presentation. We're just going to share it, and I've asked my colleague on the other side just to handle the technicalities. So we can just get the screen minus the subtitles. We can move immediately to the second slide.
Oh my goodness. I'm just having a challenge here. Apologies. It is switching over to the incorrect window.
Right, can we move to the second slide? So that really is just a brief summary of what I'm going to talk about, and I'll elaborate on each of those as we go along. So the next slide, we move to the next slide. That is a slide that I've extracted from the Health Market Inquiry. And I think it's a useful slide. Just one correction on the top left-hand side of my screen where it says MCC and the logo of the health department. That has subsequently been changed to SAHPRA, the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, which is a 3A public entity of which I'm a board member. So I think what this slide shows you is the large number of role players, from suppliers on the left, the logo of green being the public sector, the blue being the private sector, to the list of providers, both government and private sector, to the finances, which is through the medical schemes, healthcare insurers, and obviously the Road Accident Fund, injury on duty, and then government being a major funder together with the private sector. And then underneath, just interestingly, and I will allude to that on the bottom left, is SOMED, which is an industry organization with which also I've had some dealings since my retirement, and I'll deal with that. So this is extracted from the Health Market Inquiry report, and I would encourage people to go and look at that report. It's a very long report, but there's some very interesting information, and the conclusions I think are relevant going forward in the health sector. Next slide. First of all, as a healthcare professional myself, and for half my professional life, and an administrator and manager for the second half of my professional life, a key issue in health is quality. I think everybody will realize that if you are subjected to the health system, you look for safety, you look for effectiveness, you look for timeliness, you want efficiency. It should be equitable so that the person presenting to the health sector shouldn't be treated differently depending on who they are. And finally, it should be people-centered. It should take into account the preferences of an individual service user. So I think that is really a touchstone for anybody working in the health sector. Quality is a key. And so how do we assure quality? Next slide. It's important to realize that the health sector is highly regulated to ensure just what I've been talking about: quality, safety, and efficacy. It's very important. It cannot be an unregulated sector where anything is allowed to go in without having those assurances. As I mentioned just at the beginning, when I was interacting with several individuals who were considering entering the sector, when I mentioned the ISO 9001 standards, there was a sort of a blank response. So this is the International Organization for Standardization. And I'll go into that into some detail, because you will find that if you do business, particularly with the government or with the private sector, they will seek to ascertain whether your product has an ISO 9001 registration because of the safety and quality issues. The big brother in regulation is the FDA, the US Food and Drug Administration, and whatever we may think of the US, they are a major player. In South Africa, then I'll just move to the fourth bullet. The European Medicines Agency is in fact also involved with the regulation of any device or any item that is used in the medical sector in the European Union. In South Africa, the legal framework is set up by a very old act of 1965, the Medicines and Related Substances Act, Act 101 of 1965. It's been amended repeatedly, and quite frankly, it should actually be rewritten and it should become a new act. The South African Health Products Regulatory Authority stems from that act in an amendment, and that's what I will refer to from now on as SAPRA. And then the regulations relating to medical devices is published in the Government Gazette of 2016. So and that is really a very brief summary. There are multiple organizations. Zazibona is an African regulatory structure, which essentially combines the regulatory organizations of a number of African countries as well. Next slide. Now the FDA, the big brother or big sister, to be correct, politically correct, is the world leader in medical device market and in the drug market, the pharmaceutical market. And it's the body responsible for regulating companies that manufacture, import, and sell medical devices in the US is the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, the CDRH. So that any product that is going to be marketed in the US, or in fact, any product that's going to be marketed anywhere in the world, if it carries a regulatory approval of the FDA, it will have great currency. I must indicate that the cost of obtaining such a registration is very significant. And I will reflect on that a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide. Now the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, it's an independent, non-governmental international organization, 165 national standards bodies that gives it great credibility. It develops standards to ensure quality, safety, and efficiency of products, services, systems. It exists in many areas of industry, not just medicine or medical devices, but it is very relevant in the medical device sector and also in energy management. Now, what it certifies is that a management system, the manufacturing process, the service or documentation procedure has met all the requirements for standardization and quality assurance. So it's really a very important registration for a product to enter the market. So that ISO standard is an important, if one is going to go significantly into the health sector market. Next slide. Just very briefly in the next slide, I've just outlined, and I'm not going to go into this detail, but what does ISO 9001 mean? ISO is the organization, 9001 is the current standard, and 9001 is the best known standard. And it defines the criteria for meeting a number of quality management principles, and it helps businesses and organizations to be more efficient. And there is an ongoing process of maintaining the ISO standard in a particular product. And the 2015 essentially is the latest version, the 5th edition of ISO 9001. So that's what it means. And the reason I've taken a little bit of time to explain this is that I was worried in my interactions with a number of organizations and individuals that people did not understand what was this ISO 9001. There are many references in the web, and if people are interested, I suggest that they do further research in this area. Next slide. Medical devices, just let's look at them. And I've focused here largely on medical devices because I'm a health professional. And it's a very broad definition of what it is. Anything from a spatula, a wooden spatula, to a PET scanner is a medical device. So anything that is used in the health sector, particularly where a patient is involved, is a medical device. So it's a heterogeneous group of products in terms of design, use, and purpose. Some of them are combined with drugs. So an IVD, for instance, would be an item that's placed within the heart with an anticoagulant on the surface. So it can be a drug and a device. And there are a vast number, 1,700, that's a reference figure. It could be more, could be less, with a large number, estimated around about 50,000 or more products. And there's a great variety of types of firms that invent and develop medical devices. Than is the case with drugs. So actually, it's a very broad field. And I've been watching a couple of the presentations today in the sessions, and it's quite encouraging that in the Western Cape, I've seen some very innovative processes and small companies which are involved in this field. Now, characteristic of the industry has a large number of very small firms, but large companies dominate the industry in terms of sales. And the reason is the cost. I've just referred to ISO 9000 registration, and it's a costly process. The FDA, it's a costly process. So small firms and even individuals produce the most of the innovations in the early stages of developing a new class of medical devices, where the large firms play an especially important role later on in the development process, sometimes through the acquisition of small firms. So it's hopefully a symbiotic relationship of benefit to both, but it's important that often there's a need to develop a partnership with a larger company to enable the product to go to market. Next slide. Can we move? Looking at it again, just to look at it, because this is a webinar looking at innovation, the link between regulation and innovation is complex, and it's difficult to get a direct causal relationship. It's a complex relationship. So for instance, if you have less regulation, do you have more innovation or the reverse? And I think that is an interesting discussion, and to whether there is a direct connection. Many innovators complain that the strict regulation limits the ability to innovate and limits the ability to bring a product to market. And it is true that to bring a product to market in the sector, you require a long process of trials, and then finally to introduce it if it affects directly a human being. Healthcare has a high potential for innovation and growth. The US dominates the area, but there is an increasing presence of emerging players such as China. Much of the products from the East generally are products that were innovated elsewhere and then go into production in large scale in countries such as China and India. And these are ongoing challenges for innovator in a country such as South Africa. In reality, the United States accounts for almost half of all health-related patents in the world, both medical technologies and pharmaceutical products. And it probably reflects the fact of the amount of capital that is required to take a product forward. But I think what I would stress here is the need to consider the environment in which a product is being developed and the product is being brought to market. Next slide. Now, the South African regulator is, as on the title of this slide, SAHPRA is a 3A public entity, which means that it's set up in terms of South African legislation. It reports to the National Minister of Health through its board, and it was created by the government to ensure the health and well-being of human and animal health. And it regulates pharmaceutical products, it regulates medical devices, and currently all radiation emitting devices. Although there is some thoughts of moving some of that, in fact, to the National Nuclear Regulator. SAHPRA assumed the roles of the older Medicines Control Council, as well as the Director of Radiation Control, when it was formed in 2018. So SAHPRA is currently the regulatory body in the South African context. It has its own website, and there is a lot of information available there. Next slide. Now, the licensing of medical device establishments, currently, we only register the medical device establishments. Individual products are not yet licensed in this country, and the application for licensing may apply to one of three types of licenses. It can either be a manufacturer, a distributor, or a wholesaler with the functions as listed. And a call-up notice published in the Government Gazette in 2017 requested all manufacturers and distributors of medical devices to apply for a SAHPRA license. And to emphasize, no medical device may be manufactured, distributed, imported, exported, or sold without a valid SAHPRA medical device establishment license. The process to obtain these licenses, again, is on the SAHPRA website. Next slide. Just to indicate that in the regulations relating to SAHPRA, a medical device is classified from A, B, C, D, A being very low risk, and as I referred to earlier, a spatula or a relatively minor piece of equipment, to a class D where there is a high risk to the patient by the use of this medical device, and that relates to the patient or possibly broadly to public health. And obviously the licensing of these becomes more arduous as you move up the class where the risk becomes higher. Next slide. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but I did mention, and I think it's important for new entrants to the field, should be aware that there is an organization. It's a voluntary organization, the South African Medical Technology Industry Association, abbreviated SOMET. And I think that the collective involvement of an association of this nature may be of assistance to new entrants to the field. They have developed a code which is binding on SAMET members. It's not binding legally. It binds them by the fact that they have voluntarily joined the code. And it's a code device for the ethical, medical device code for the ethical marketing and business practice. The adoption of the code is an outcome of SAMET's vision. I'm not here to promote SAMET, but I think it's important that entrance into this field and those in the field should be aware of SAMET if you're not already aware of such. Next slide. A reality in South Africa is broad-based economic empowerment. And I'm not going to go into this a lot of detail, but I just wanted to emphasize the fact that certain industries require an entity at a particular percentage of ownership or BEE level. And this is particularly relevant if you're going to do business with government. And I've listed on this slide, which I trust would be available to people if they were interested. But effectively, it's important to remember that the BEE aspects of the Act apply in the South African context. Next slide. And I've just summarized here that if you transact with organs of state, you're generally required to issue a request, an RFP for any work they intended to source. The response to the RFP is scored, the request for a proposal is scored in terms of your BEE status. Transacting with the private entities is different. However, a company will score better for BEE for itself if it procures goods and services from another entity with a high BEE rating. So whether it's the organ of state, such as the Department of Health, or it is a private entity, the BEE rating is relevant in this sector. Next slide. Now, business opportunities in the health sector. And I would just draw participants' attention to the bottom of the slide, the PricewaterhouseCoopers report titled Global Health New Entry Meeting the World's Consumer. I've just extracted a few bullet points from this report, and I can really recommend this report as useful reading. So new entrants from retail, technology, etc., are seizing opportunities and bringing new ideas in the healthcare industry. And as I mentioned this morning, I watched and participated in a session where several innovators from working in the Western Cape presented their products. And it was a very good example of this. It's interesting that innovations spring more rapidly from emerging economies than from developing countries. And I would assume that need drives the innovation, or innovation is driven by need. And I've just given an example there of the mobile doctors network as referenced in the document I've referred to. But I think that we've learned with COVID, and I was reading a report only yesterday, that the impact of COVID has been to drive us to virtualization of care. Some of the large healthcare providers and Discovery and others have begun to use the possibility of a virtual consultation. There are ethical and medical issues with this, but I think important if there is access and bandwidth, the possibilities here are almost endless. And it has, as is stated here, the possibility of raising healthcare boundaries and enabling an access to care almost anywhere. So I think it's a very exciting development. Telemedicine's been around for a long time, but I think now that the technology has developed and the drive is there, I think there are many opportunities in this particular area for particularly the new entrepreneur. Next slide. Just a bit of a boring slide, but I thought as I've been a public servant a lot of my life, and many people coming into the state don't necessarily understand how state and government-led procurement works. Just, I would refer you to, and it's on the web, the legislative framework is set out in terms of National Treasury regulations. The National Treasury regulations, based on the Public Finance and Management Act, are the textbook or the handbook of how a public servant procures. And in chapter 8, it talks about supply chain management. So procurement of an item is either on contract, in which case there's been a process where there's been a tender advertised, a contract has been awarded, then a department or a hospital may purchase directly, or a province may purchase directly from that contract, depending if the funds are available, the need is identified, and there's the correct procurement, and they have the delegations to do so. If it's not on contract, then you have to undertake a procurement process, and just listed there. I have a very long presentation on state procurement. I've just extracted one slide just to indicate that you need to understand, if you're going to do business with government, how the process works. Next slide. So I drew up this checklist when doing business with government, thinking about my experience. The first question you need to ask yourself is, do you or your company fully understand the processes with which within government? Lease agreements are unusual in the government sector, and as I'll mention in the next slide or next couple of slides, much more common in the private sector. Secondly, has the department adhered to requisite process with respect to the method of procurement as prescribed in the PFMA and relevant Treasury instructions? Now you may ask, what's that got to do with me or my company? The fact is that if they have not adhered to those requisite processes, the expenditure becomes irregular and your company becomes involved in irregular expenditure. Does your bid fully adhere to the detailed requirements of tender documents? Tax clearance certificate, registration with a central supplier database. As a senior bureaucrat, if the number of offended and upset companies that beat their way to my door because their bid was not accepted, we were to find out that they did not have a valid tax clearance certificate. Failing that, doesn't matter how good your bid is, you're excluded. And that's the most common reason for exclusion of a bidder from a government tender process. And then finally, has any expectation been created that an incentive is expected to be considered as a participant in a pure procurement process? If so, report this immediately to the fraud line. It's illegal. It's against the law. And I would stress the point that procurement in the public sector has nothing to do with a political principle. So companies should not go and put the sales pitch to the MEC or the minister or the premier. They should go through a procurement process. Any involvement of a politician in the procurement process is irregular, illegal, and there is the potential of fraud. I don't think I need to stress that anymore if you consider all of the happenings around us, even those in the last day or so. Next slide. Then the other issue is, in terms of doing business with government, I would suggest that companies need to research the department they're doing business with. Is there a history of significant accruals? Have they had a qualified audit with a regular and unauthorized expenditure? And those audit reports are available in the public domain. Is there a history of delays in the payment of invoices? They should be paid within 30 days. And it's noteworthy if they're not. Government departments generally do not pay interest on the outstanding accounts. If those risks are there, then you do business with government at your risk. So it's important to understand with whom you're doing business. Next slide. The private sector. So South Africa's healthcare industry is one of the most dynamic sectors in the world, particularly the private sector. I think many people know these statistics. I'm not going to go into it, but the public sector caters for 80% of the population, private sector for 20%, and they both spend more or less the same amount of money. So clearly, the money is in the private sector, relatively speaking, per population. And then there's a small amount that is spent by non-governmental organizations. Next slide. But the private health sector is an interesting place. In terms of remembering that the private health sector is largely dominated by hospitals. Private hospitals do not employ doctors. Doctors, in terms of the regulation of the Health Professions Council, are not allowed to be employed by private hospitals. and hospitals are not allowed to employ them. But the private hospitals provide the environment in which private doctors work. So they can also, in fact, influence what happens and what private doctors do. The big three is Netcare, Life Healthcare, and Mediclinic, and they dominate the market. There are other smaller operators that are grouped together in the National Hospital Network, the NHN, and then the rest are independent, working on their own. So those big three, and the health market inquiry that I referred to earlier, has raised the concern of a dominance of these big three being able to, in fact, influence the way the market functions. Next slide. Just a graphic representation to show you how big they are compared to the other players. So you look at Mediclinic, Life Healthcare, and Netcare, essentially it's the whole market. And that's a document extracted from a report in, I think around about 2017. It hasn't changed markedly since then. Next slide. So what about a checklist when doing business with the private sector, private health sector? First of all, the lack of competition in the private sector, as highlighted by the health market inquiry, results in a situation where healthy competition is hindered. That's the finding of the health market inquiry, but also where the big three have significant leverage with suppliers, not as a collective, but individually, because they are so large. I mean, the capital holding of the big three individually runs into billions of rands. There's potentially a greater flexibility to negotiate with dealing with the private sector, but given the comment I've just made above about their size and their dominance, it's a double-edged sword. In other words, your ability, if you're a smaller provider, to negotiate with a giant market player is limited. As with the government sector, I would ask, do you and your company fully understand the procurement and acquisition processes of the private sector company with which you intend to do business? And I would here spread away from just the big three hospitals, but remembering there are companies in the medical device sector and the medical radiation sector, who also, in fact, are South African representatives of larger multinational companies. And then finally, is in the health sector with hospitals, is the intention of the company to purchase or lease. Lease arrangements are a much more common manner of acquisition for medical equipment in the private sector, for various reasons, not alone tax, but also in terms of being able to replace and maintain equipment. Next slide. So in conclusion, and this is a slide I've used in various presentations, thus let the seller, brackets industry, beware. The Latin term caveat venditor means let the seller beware. It cautions the seller is responsible for any problem the buyer may encounter with a service or product. Now that's very relevant, particularly if you're an innovator and a small startup, remembering that if something goes wrong, you can be wiped out by the medical legal implications thereof in terms of court cases. However, given the current state of finances and management in most provincial departments of health, I would add to an extent post-COVID, because of the tremendous financial burden that COVID has placed on these health departments. In the private sector, I would alter the focus of the traditional interpretation of caveat venditor to include that the seller accepts and has evaluated the risk of doing business in the health sector. It's not an area, considering those issues that I've stressed in terms of quality and the expectations, that is without risk in terms of the product that is developed, be it a simple product or a highly advanced product. Next slide. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to Wesco for the opportunity to share some of my views with you. And I trust that that will have assisted some people in the sector to do business in the health sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Househam. That was a very informative presentation. I must admit I did learn quite a few things myself today. We have not yet received any Q&As, and I would just like to invite our attendees to submit their Q&As as soon as possible. But while they do that, I do have a question, and that's a burning question I've had on my mind since last night. And what is your one bit of advice for young innovators who are dreaming about coming up with something fantastic for the health sector and really making a contribution to South African citizens?
Well, I think my advice would be is understand the sector, understand where the problems are, focus on the issues that are facing the health sector. And currently, what is facing the health sector, if you look at the government sector, it is numbers. I've just been involved in an assessment of some hospitals' ability to manage the COVID pandemic. And it really reinforced in my mind, having not necessarily walked through hospitals in the last number of years, is the volume and the complexity that we are dealing with. And so I think that innovators should really think about the whole pathway from the patient's home through the community to the community-based services, to the hospitals, and then to delivery. I think one of the innovations that we, in fact, initiated in the Western Cape when I was the head of the department was the home delivery of medication. And I think that has proved a boon in the COVID era, where state patients have been able to have their medication delivered, and innovatively, for instance, using an Uber based project to deliver medicines to somebody's home in Khayelitsha or Mitchell's Plain or Grassy Park. So there are many opportunities, but I think it requires somebody with an open mind, and I'm probably too old, in my seventh decade, to have that innovative spirit. But I think a young, fresh view of what are the challenges and how can we solve it. I've touched on in my presentation the opportunities that our new virtual environment creates. Here we are talking to one another in a manner that we could never have done before. So I'm looking at you, and if I were a dermatologist, I could say, well, you could tell me you have a funny bump, and I could say, well, I think it's this, this, and this, and I think you should do the following. Again, can we do that in a way that meets the requirements of efficacy, quality, and safety? And if we can, well, it's got an opportunity in the future.
Fantastic. And we have, the questions are definitely coming in. So this is really great. So the first person is anonymous. Thanks, Prof. That was great. What is your view on fighting corruption in the public health sector?
Well, thank you for the question. And it's something that bothers me. And as a health professional, it enrages me that we see money and funds being wasted on frivolous issues, on where they could be saving lives. They could be providing people with quality healthcare. First of all, I touched on it in the presentation. If you do business with government, if anything is expected of you other than the product that you are selling or providing, pull back and report it, and don't be afraid. Secondly, I think that we need, as a country, and this is rather hackneyed, but to restore our moral compass in that we don't allow these things to happen. And then finally, as I mentioned, no politician, no matter how prominent or how honest or full of how much integrity they've got, should be involved in any way in a procurement process. And that also goes for the private sector, because I think that if undue pressure is placed on somebody to provide a product at a special price and an incentive is expected from anybody, it should be removed. So I think that again, a watchdog, I would encourage anybody who has an awareness of anything that is irregular within the public sector or the health sector to report it. And hopefully with the new approach that we're seeing after many years to deal conclusively and effectively with corruption, we'll have some traction because we need it.
Just a follow-up question from my side on that specifically. I assume you're also referring to not only when you're doing business with governments in South Africa, but surely the same should go for if you find corruption of any nature in any dealings with any government across the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I don't wish to go into details, but as a senior bureaucrat, I had to stand firm against, in my career, against attempts to subvert a process, no matter how subtle, with the possibility of getting a particular deal. And unfortunately, you know, people seem to think that just a minor incentive, such as getting a ticket to a rugby match or a soccer match, that is equal to getting a large amount of money. They're all the same in principle. You may not receive any incentive from anybody to provide a service.
Great. So we have 2 more questions so far. The next person, also anonymous, very insightful, Prof. Realistically, what is the chance the health sector will buy local innovation, and how do we get them to become more aware of what is being done in South Africa instead of importing?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because, as I've mentioned, it's a highly regulated environment, and unfortunately, as I've mentioned as well, the cost of becoming both competitive and becoming fulfilling the requirements of regulation limit the ability of small startup companies and smaller companies. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that maybe COVID it's caused economic disaster and pain and suffering. But one of the major issues that may come out of it is, in fact, that we may begin to think more carefully of buying South African or buying South African produced products. And I'll give a very simple example. You know that South Africa was almost totally dependent for the manufacture of medical masks on imports. And a hospital I visited in the last couple of weeks, the comment was made that the only masks they got were from China, and they couldn't actually determine the criteria of these masks because they couldn't understand Chinese. Now, and they had to get a Chinese translation, fortunately there's an app, to actually determine whether this was a medical mask or not. It turned out one of the masks they were sold was actually a dust mask. It wasn't a medical mask, but it came from China. Now, I cannot see why a medical mask, a surgical mask, an N95 mask should not effectively and more cost effectively be able to be manufactured in South Africa. We understand the challenges of cheap labor, particularly in China and India. However, I think the strategic advantages of promoting South African manufacturers may be something that in the future we look much more seriously in that direction. I hope so, because I think we've learned a lesson. We should not be dependent on the rest of the world. Even Europe and North America, when we tried to get ventilators, we discovered that in fact they bought up all the supply and we were without the possibility of actually importing ventilators. But I think maybe it's a partnership between the private sector, as I mentioned in the US, the big players and the small players to work together to actually manufacture products in this country.
Great. And I think in the meantime, we will go wherever we can at Westgrove, for example, and others to promote whatever local products are available, and even our new entrepreneurs as much as possible, just to at least to raise some awareness and get them talking to one another to, see what we can do about this thing. We have a question from Derek Allen. If we are a hub receiving international orders and then relaying these orders to the different suppliers and they perform the export, do we require SAPRA licensing?
No, I don't want to put myself out on a limb. I'm only a board member for SAPRA. I'm not the executive, the chief executive officer. But my understanding is that if you're an importer, you're an exporter, you are a manufacturer or a supplier, you require a license from SAPRA. The requirements for that license are not that rigorous. They will become more rigorous for manufacturers in the future when products themselves are registered. But I would suggest that if that is an issue for the person who's asked the question, that they direct that for clarity to the CEO or the Chief Operating Officer of SAPRA for a formal response. That would be my view, but I'm not the CEO of SAPRA. I sit on the board. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the end of the Q&A, and then I just have one last question, Professor. You know, you've had many years of experience in this industry, and I wanted to just know, what is your hope for health innovation in the next 10 years?
Well, I would hope, and I mean, I really applaud the initiative of Westgrow, and I think that in the Western Cape in particular, with the particular concentration of institutions of higher learning, the health sector delivery, private and public, and I think in the Western Cape, and I probably be regarded as biased by saying so, but I think the Western Cape Provincial Health Department, and I've been gone for a while, even in handling the COVID-19 epidemic, has shown that it can do it better than anywhere else. So that you've got this concentration of expertise, and it's not just in the health sector. It's clearly you need commerce, you need business, you need the environment, you need the infrastructure. So it's here. Then I think there's a need for partnerships. And as I've mentioned, I think that the small startup is struggling, but there's a need for partnership, be it with key individuals or with a company, preserving the intellectual property that is created. I would hope that we can develop like a Silicon Valley. Why not, let's call it the shadow of Table Mountain. How do we develop that to enable us to become it's an industry and a growth industry in the Western Cape as a possibility? I think we have all the possibilities. If you look how the IT sector started in Silicon Valley, it was because a fruitful environment was created for companies to coexist together, compete, but also build off one another. And I think that we need to look. We've got buyback, the government, quasi-government structure that deals with vaccines, and whether or not we can now produce, in the end, a COVID vaccine in this country for Africa. I mean, all of these opportunities are there, and I think it depends, as with most, is somebody with an idea and drive to get it together and drive it forward. So I think the opportunity is there. It just requires maybe the spark, and maybe Westgrow can light the fire.
Thank you. Well, I certainly am very proud of all the work that does happen in the Western Cape and the amazing innovators that we do have here in the sector. They are, in my mind, the unsung heroes of the Western Cape economy. And it's definitely my mission to make sure that people get to know about them. And if we have a sneaky one last question, and I think this is a pretty good one. What is next for a retired professor, and what is your next goal?
Well, I'm hardly retired. You know, I'm retired and I enjoy it very much. I mean, to be frank, to be out of the yoke of being an accounting officer and facing the daily and nightly challenges 7 days a week, particularly when Helen Zille was my premier in the Western Cape, I'm glad I'm out of that. But no, I'm on the board of 2 public entities, the SAPRA and the Office of Health Standards Compliance. I do pro bono work for a large hospice in Cape Town. I do consulting work. And I've been taxed by various, well, the two ministers, the current and the previous minister, to do investigations. I'm a bit sad that the recommendations, those investigations didn't go a long way. And that's the problem of being a consultant. You can no longer affect what you do. And I ride a Harley Davidson, so I can take to the open road whenever I feel like it. So I'm 72 and I enjoy life. And what more could you want for next? It's a God-given right to live a few years longer. So that's what I do. Thanks for the question, whoever asked it.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. So we have come to the end of the webinar and there's 10 minutes left. So I think you can enjoy a cup of coffee and check the weather to see what it's going to look like for a potential ride on Sunday on your Harley. So thank you everybody for attending, and especially to you, Professor Househam, for the time today. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.